Please rise for the national anthem.
जनगण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड़ उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तव जय गाथा जनगण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे
A very good morning to all of you, and best wishes to everyone for a Hindu Navavarsha Din or Gudi Padwa that is coming on Wednesday. A special welcome to my dear friend, ex-colleague and Speaker of the Day, Sanjeev Sanyal, Member, Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. May I please request Madan Vajpayee of Prabodhan Mancha to please welcome him with a shawl, Shrifar and a book. Friends, just the day before, I think 17th of March it was the third Remembrance Day for our beloved Honorable Raksha Mantri Manohar Parrikar ji. It was his speech that saw us start this activity on May 28, 2016. And I'm very sure it is his blessings that have got us this far. We are in our 7th year, our 31st program. I by mistake said 2 more last time when I met you. We have 1 million plus views on YouTube, 300 plus contributors, and 3,000 plus database of audience. And yes, this week, our repeat contributors crossed 100. So a big thank you to all of you. Our speaker today, and I think I mentioned this last week as well, he's not just generally well known, but he's extremely well known to this audience. I mean, who can forget, Sanjeev, your famous Frisbee theory when you spoke to us last time, and something which I think has proven to be absolutely correct and effective for India, even as we came through very well through the crisis of COVID. So thank you for that theory, and thank you for enlightening us last time. As India completed 75 years of its independence, what remains largely etched about the freedom struggle is "De di hame azadi bina khadg bina dhal." Was it so? Savarkar, Aurobindo, Rashabihari Bose, Sachindranath, Bhagat Singh, Azad, Subhash Chandra Bose, were they isolated instances, or was there more to their story? Well, in a country where the history has been often written through a lens of Western world, or through those supporting a particular party or a family, how does one unfold the untold story of our revolutionaries? Well, who better than Sanjeev to tell us about that? So as always, we will take Q&A, albeit written, and yes, we will screen them for appropriateness and for better coverage. But do pass on your questions to our volunteers. Sanjeev, welcome. So Sanjeev had a request that there is a song which all of us know, and he specifically said if we could play it today. You know the song, but it's a slightly different version, and Sanjeev said whether we could hear us, then we would like us to hear this one.
Thank you, my friend, Murgank. Before I get going, let me explain why I wanted this song to be played. These were the third and fourth stanzas of the song Vande Mataram by Bankim Chandra. And as some of you may know that Vande Mataram has actually got 5 stanzas. The first 2 are part of our national song. This is the third and fourth stanzas. So the rendition that you just heard is of those 2 stanzas. And the reason I wanted you to listen to them is that these are the 2 stanzas that the revolutionaries would sing to the gallows. So, first of all, let me thank my friend Murgank and the organizers of Prabodhan Manch, Parle, who have invited me right here for the second time. Last time I was here, I think about 4 years ago or thereabouts. And to all of you for making time on a Sunday morning to come and listen to a somewhat serious subject. So I hope I will hold up to your expectations. The topic I'm going to speak about is about my book, recent book, named Revolutionaries, the other history of how India won its freedom. Now, right in the beginning, let me tell you, it is not my case to say that the non-violent movement was not important at all. It had a certain importance, certainly, but it was not the only story. There was also a long history of armed resistance to the British. This history went back right to the beginning in the 18th century when the British were trying to colonize India. And in fact, other European powers also tried to do it. So this goes back even further back to the resistance of the Portuguese and so on. And this resistance, in the beginning, of course, was done by the old nobility of that time and the various groups that exist in the 18th and early 19th century. The Marathas, the Sikhs, the Pikers, the Polygars, and so on. But by 1857-58, when the Great Revolt took place and was brutally suppressed, this sort of cycle of armed resistance to the British basically broke down. And yes, there were occasional sort of sparks of resistance subsequently as well. For example, by the nobility of Manipur in the early 1890s, or that of the tribals led by Birsa Munda, and so on. But frankly, they were never really a threat to British rule. So a new cycle of resistance using arms did start around about the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And what I'm going to talk to you about is this phase of the armed resistance, which is broadly known as the revolutionary movement. Now, many of the names relating to the revolutionary movement have not been forgotten. Many of them are still household names. So Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, Subhash Bose, Raj Bihari Bose, and so on. Some of them have been forgotten, but enough of them are still remembered. But the impression you get is they were random acts of resistance. So there would be, somebody would go and throw a bomb or do something there, perhaps heroic. But the impression you get from our textbooks and from the mainstream narrative is that these were individual acts of heroism at best that did not add up to anything. There was no strategy. They did not have any real influence on the course of events and so on. And what I'm going to try and show you, ladies and gentlemen, that is a complete misrepresentation of the role the revolutionaries played in our freedom struggle. Not only are they important in their own right, even understanding the Gandhians and the non-violent movement is only possible if you understand the revolutionaries. In fact, the revolutionaries were not even separate from the Congress. They were large enough in the Congress. At various points in time, they had enough power in the Congress to win elections in their own right. For example, in the late 1930s, Netaji, with the support of the revolutionaries, actually won an open election inside the Congress against the Gandhians. So, even to understand the national Indian National Congress and the non-violent movement, you've got to understand what the revolutionaries were trying to do. So here is their story. By the nature of a lecture like this, I have really shrunk it down. But I hope that I'll be able to give you some frame of reference to understanding this incredible group of people. And they were not a small group of people. There were tens of thousands of them, spread not only across India, but as you will see, all over the world. So this movement really got going, as I said, towards the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. To understand this group, you need to understand another thing, that they were influenced by a whole bunch of different influences. So, first of all, they were not quite a continuation of the previous round of resistance to the Europeans, in the sense that they were in many ways completely modernists. They were not trying to go back to the, unlike to the Maratha Empire or to the British or to the Mughal Empire and so on. They were very much about going forward, and as you will see, they were the first to actually come up with the idea of India being a totally independent, democratic republic. They were modernists. When they talked about the Swadeshi movement, unlike the Gandhians, they were not so keen on going back to the charkha, but wanted to modernize India very quickly, using heavy industry in many cases. So this was a very different line of thought. This was a completely modernist line of thought. And this was happening at a time of enormous upheaval intellectually and culturally. So after the defeat in the 1858 revolt, there was a sudden loss of cultural confidence as well. The British were clearly technologically advanced. They were using many of the tools of the state, but were also undermining India culturally, quite deliberately. For example, with the use of Christian missionaries. So this was a response that was happening at that time, whether, for example, Swami Vivekananda and Hindu revivalism in many forms. You had the Sikh reform movements. You had Dayanand Saraswati and the Arya Samaj movement. You had Sri Aurobindo himself, who I'll come to shortly. They were also influenced, by the way, by many modern ideas that had been made available through the learning of English, interestingly. For example, they were close to the Irish nationalists. They were inspired by the Italian nationalists Mazzini and Garibaldi. And of course, they were hugely influenced after 1905 by the rise of Japan, which had in 1905 defeated the Russians, the first time in many centuries that an Asiatic power had defeated a European power. So these were all the various influences that were sort of mixing and matching and influencing this group. And out of this, two remarkable characters emerged. One was Sri Aurobindo and the other was Vinayak Savarkar. This is the first decade of the 20th century. And Sri Aurobindo, then known as Aurobindo Ghosh, was living not far away from here in Baroda, and he was both the personal assistant of the ruler of Baroda, Sayaji Gaikwad, and he was also the vice principal of Baroda College, which was now known as MS University, named after Maharaj Sayaji Gaikwad. And he came up with the idea that in order to resist the British, you now need to create a network of revolutionaries using a much older network of akhadas. Now, many people have forget today that India from very ancient times had a system of akhadas. Every village, every community had an akhada. Almost every single temple had an akhada. Every sampradaya had an akhada. And these akhadas were not necessarily peaceful places. They were places of military training, up-to-date military training. They were the key reason why, despite centuries of invasions and defeat of many of the military and princely classes, India continued to have a form of resistance to foreign domination, because essentially of this akhada network, no matter which king you defeated, there was always at every village there was some akhada imparting military training, organizing some kind of organized resistance to foreign domination. And they were key to the resistance to the Turks, to the Mughals, and also to the British. But by the end of the 19th century, this group was getting rapidly secularized and being converted into youth clubs, so to speak. And their original military aspect was slowly eroding away. A lot of it deliberately, because that's what the British were trying to do. So, Aurobindo Ghosh said, I'm going to organize this group of akhadas back, and they're across the country. They have slightly different names in various places. In the south, they are called the Kaladi. In east, in Assam, they are called the Khatras, and so on. I'm sure there is a version of this in Maharashtra as well. Like, for example, the Malkham is a part of that tradition. And so, he said, I'm going to revive this network, and we are going to use this as a network to resist the British. So, he began to create this network, and it came to be known as the Anushilan Samiti. This is the name by which the revolutionaries would know themselves. Now, some people may ask, why such a strange name? Anushilan Samiti, it just literally means the discipline committee. That's because of this link to the akhadas. Now, this network began to spread all across India, but of course their hub was Bengal, where Aurobindo Ghosh shifted to Kolkata, and he and his brother Barin began to build this massive network. And while he was doing this, he also wrote a sort of a manual for it, very short, 18-page manual called Bhavani Mandir. The idea was that its heart of this would be a worship of Bhavani and a temple to Bhavani. And there were all these warrior monks who would go out there and create shakhas to fight the British. So this was the manual, Bhavani Mandir. It's available freely on PDF. Read it. And I will come back to it very shortly. So this network was being built. Even as another young man, Vinayak Savarkar, was sitting in London in a hostel called India House, where he was also creating a group of young students who were based in London studying, and he was radicalizing them into many of these ideas as well, about nationalism and so on. Again, inspired by many of these things, both, ancient Indian and medieval Indian resistance to foreign invasions, particularly the character of Shivaji being a very important character across India, by the way, not just to Savarkar. And then this network began to slowly spread into continental Europe, particularly to Paris, where Bhikaji Kama and others, S.R. Rana and others, began to also create modules and so on. So by basically the end of that decade, there was a network of these revolutionaries that was emerging. And by the way, the British were entirely aware of this, and they were keeping close tabs on them. So basically in 1909, the British decided to crack down because of a series of assassinations carried out by this network. In Bengal, there was a crackdown against the Anushilan Samiti. Barin Ghosh and many of his group were sent off to Kalapani. Some of them were sent to the gallows as well. And of course, famously, Aurobindo Ghosh was escaped to French territory in Pondicherry, where he would continue to live for the next several decades. So this is what happens there. Meanwhile, there is a crackdown on Savarkar himself. One of his followers, by the way, Madan Lal Dhingra, carried out an assassination of a senior official in London. And so there's a crackdown in London against London House. And Savarkar, of course, is captured. This is not an audience where I'm going to give a long history of Savarkar. But he is, of course, after his attempt to escape in Marseille, he also gets ultimately shipped off to cellular jail in Kalapani. So this first round of resistance to the first generation of revolutionaries comes to an abrupt end in about 1909-1910. And the British may have thought that they had put the genie back in the bottle. But in fact, the writings of both Aurobindo Ghosh and Vinayak Savarkar by this point had been replicated into underground literature and had already generated a second generation of revolutionaries. Leading this generation were two remarkable characters in India. One was Raj Bihari Bose and his lieutenant, Sachindranath Sanyal. And they then began, after the sort of breakdown of the first generation, they began in around about 1911, 12, 13, they began to revive this network one piece at a time, and not just in Bengal, but also in Punjab, in UP, in Maharashtra, and so on. They began to put it all together. And in 1912, they decided that they had to make a statement. So what is going on in 1912 is that the capital is being shifted from Kolkata to Delhi. So in 1911 it gets announced, but it's only in 1912 that they actually get around to doing this. And in December of 1912, Lord Hardinge, the Viceroy of India, decides that the formal shift is going to happen, and in order to sort of celebrate the formal shift, there's going to be this grand cavalcade of elephants, horses, etc., that will enter what was then Delhi, which is now called Old Delhi, Shahjahanabad, and they're going to go down Chandni Chowk, which is the main arterial road, to demonstrate British power and symbolically take over the crown, so to speak. So this cavalcade is making its way down Chandni Chowk, but Raj Bihari Bose and an assistant are hiding in a wholesale market called Katra Dhulia. And as it passes by, Lord Hardinge on his elephant, they throw a bomb, which hits its target. It actually kills the Mahout, but it doesn't kill Lord Hardinge, but he's very grievously injured. He almost dies, and he ends up in hospital for some 6 months or something. And it's a major blow to the British Empire, that right in the heart of the British Empire, in a major event, the Viceroy is almost killed. But of course, in the confusion of that bombing, Raj Bihari Bose and Basanta Biswas, who is his assistant, they escape. They make their way out. Raj Bihari Bose makes his way back to Dehradun, where he was working at the Forestry Research Institute. And having reached there, he then organizes a large event where he vociferously condemns the bombing and attack on the Viceroy. He makes such a convincing job of it that when 6 months later Lord Hardinge visits Dehradun, he's actually made the chairman of the welcoming committee. Now meanwhile, in the other side of the world, a follower of Veer Savarkar called Lala Hardayal makes his way to California. And there he begins to find this large Indian community, mostly Punjabi and Punjabi Sikh community, which is also there. And they are also seething with nationalist ideas. Because they had been, meanwhile, as in Punjab, been listening to another remarkable character called Ajit Singh, who is actually Bhagat Singh's uncle. And again, not much remembered today, but in fact, in some ways, he was a more important character in our freedom struggle. And so Hardayal begins to sort of work with them, and he then creates a network of these gurudwaras, just like akhadas were being done in India. He creates this network of gurudwaras where he begins to spread a newsletter called the Ghadar, which literally means the revolt, and through it he begins to spread all these ideas of revolt against the British Empire. Now, 1913 rolls in. We can clearly see that something bad is going to happen in the world, because while the trigger is a single incident of an assassination that leads to the First World War, but certainly the clouds of war were already floating around. And the revolutionaries decide that this is an opportunity to do what they had attempted to do in 1857, which is to cause a revolt in the British Indian Army. So Raj Bihari Bose leaves Dehradun, he moves to Varanasi and begins to live in a neighborhood still called Bengali Tola, where Sachindranath Sanyal and his extended family were operating. And using these narrow lanes, they begin to essentially create a hub from where they begin to spread all over India, preparing India for this great revolt. And in particularly, they infiltrate all the regiments that were being built up in anticipation of the war. And of course, the war also starts, so this whole thing begins to gather pace. So they decide, as this whole thing begins to gather pace, that they are going to trigger this great revolt in the British Indian Army just as they are going to be shipped out to Europe. And the date is set in February of 1915. So it's all set. The date, time, everything is set. There's going to be this massive revolt rolling from Punjab across India and then to all the regiments around the world. Unfortunately, just a couple of days before this is going to happen, one of the key members of the planning committee switches sides and tells the British intelligence about this plan in Lahore. And immediately the British change all the guards at the armories from Indian guards to European guards. So this revolt never happens, except in Singapore where they haven't got the information. And for about a week, the Indian regiment in Singapore revolts and holds Singapore. Ultimately, it's put down, of course, ironically, with the help of the Japanese, who were allies of the British in the First World War. Anyway, this particular attempt clearly fails. There are occasional sporadic sort of revolts, but they never quite build up to anything. And it's very clear that this didn't work. And the British are now hunting for Raj Bihari Bose and Sachin Sanyal. They escape back to Varanasi, but it's very clear that eventually they'll be caught. So Raj Bihari Bose goes to Kolkata and, disguised as a cousin of Rabindranath Tagore, he makes his way to Japan, where he will spend the next several decades. Meanwhile, many of the others staying back in India are either arrested, some are sent to the gallows. Sachindranath Sanyal is shipped off again to cellular jail in Port Blair, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't end there. Raj Bihari Bose had ended up in Japan. He now contacts the Ghadarites in North America. And they say that, look, let's get in touch with the Germans and the Turks who are fighting the British. And yes, the Germans are very enthusiastic about helping them. So the Germans say that we'll give you lots of arms, ammunition, etc. You guys take on the British Empire. Meanwhile, the network of Gurudwaras in North America is also activated. So they are also kind of seething to get going. And remember, this is quite dangerous for the British because remember, there are large numbers of Sikhs in the British Indian Army. But the British, of course, are aware of all of this. To be fair to them, their intelligence is all throughout this entire thing will turn out to be absolutely excellent. They know that this is going on. So they begin to hunt Hardinge. They can't quite do something in California because the Americans are still neutral. They're swaying to the British, but they're still neutral. But in British Columbia, they begin to hunt down the Ghadarites, and they begin to infiltrate all the Gurudwaras with their own loyalists and collaborators. Large amounts of money is put behind this. Somebody called Hopkinson, a British agent, is put into all of this. And so what happens is, inside these Gurudwaras, there is a complete schism between those who are collaborating with the British and the nationalist Ghadarites, and there are gunfights that happen inside these Gurudwaras. Ultimately, many of the collaborators begin to be hunted and killed by the Ghadarites, revolutionaries. The loyalists, of course, respond to this, and there's a guy called Bela Singh who begins to respond by actually hunting the revolutionaries. So there are these gunfights, and many of them die on either side. Bela Singh, in broad daylight, kills two revolutionary Ghadarites in a Gurudwara, and of course, he has to be arrested. But everybody knows that there'll be a sham case in which the British will basically release him because, he's one of their key agents. So this case happens in a Canadian court. Everybody knows that he'll be released. Hopkinson himself turns up to give a testimony. But as he's about to step up to give his testimony, a Ghadarite called Mula Singh stands up, pulls out a revolver, and shoots him dead in court. He's, of course, immediately caught and he would go on to get hanged. But I'm just telling you about his story because Mula Singh is totally forgotten in India. And Bela Singh, of course, he is exonerated. In fact, this assassination is further proof that he is an innocent chap and a nice loyalist to the King Emperor. But he is so continuously being hunted in Canada that he decides it's actually safer for him to go back to Punjab. So he moved back to Punjab, but even there, the revolutionaries hunt him down and kill him. But what this entire episode does is that creates this schism in the Canadian Sikh community and creates a schism that remains to this day, and we know it as the Khalistani movement. And if you always wonder why it is that in Canada and the UK that you have this very strongly anti-Indian, anti-Hindu sentiment in some of the Gurudwara networks, it goes all the way back to British intelligence operations during the First World War against the Ghadarites. And the true founder of Khalistan, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is a British agent called Hopkinson. Never forget that. Now, all of this is going on, and the Germans, meanwhile, have purchased 30,000 rifles. And they say that we're going to supply it and be able to deliver it to the Indian revolutionaries if they've got their act together. So Raj Bihari, through his agents, gets in touch with a Bengali nationalist called Bagha Jatin, who has got this large network ready to receive these guns. And they're giving them training in all kinds of secret locations. And it is decided that all these guns are going to be supplied through two different routes, but ultimately they'll end up along the Bengal-Odisha coast, where they will be landed, and then immediately they'll be distributed in this network. And then on Christmas Day in 1915, they are going to surround Kolkata, which was still, by the way, for all practical purpose, still functioning as the capital, and they were going to carry out this major attack and take it over. Unfortunately, a key German agent who was supposed to help them take these guns from the North America through Southeast Asia and land them in the Odisha coast, he switches sides. Chap called Kraft, Vincent Kraft, if I am not remember. And in Singapore, he tells the British intelligence again what's going to happen. So the British know what's going to happen. They capture all these shipments. But Bagha Jatin doesn't know this. So he's waiting on Balasore coast, waiting for these shipments to come. He doesn't know the ships won't come. What do turn up, however, is a large contingent of police troops. And he gets surrounded, and there's a gunfight, and he and his colleague essentially fight to death. Many people still remember the name of Bagha Jatin, and at least in eastern India, in Bengal and Odisha, etc., he's quite famous. And they know that he died in a gunfight, but they don't very often tell you why is it that he was there at all. This is why he was there. Despite this, the revolutionaries don't lose hope. They then they sign up with the Germans and the Turks and say, okay, help us try to invade India from the west. So with the support of the Turks, who were also part of the German alliance, they then sent two groups. One group led by somebody called Raja Mahendra Pratap Singh. He and Barkatullah Khan make their way through to Afghanistan and try to instigate the king of Afghanistan to invade India from the west. While another remarkable Indian revolutionary called Pandurang Khankoji, also fellow Maharashtrian from Nagpur, he then leads a small ragtag army of Persian irregulars, Germans, and so on. And they try to invade India through Balochistan. The British, again, of course, know all of this is going on, and they set up a group, send an expeditionary force to try and stop this, led by another person whose name you will all know, Reginald Dyer. So Reginald Dyer originally made his name fighting against Indian revolutionaries in the Balochistan-Iran border. That's where he originally made his name. And of course, the war goes on. The Germans lose. And Pandurang Khankoji finds himself trapped in Iran. He tries to come back to India. He does visit Bombay, by the way, disguised as a Persian. But it's quite clear that, he will be eventually captured and be sent to the gallows. So he escapes out, goes briefly to Russia, where he meets Lenin, but he's not quite convinced by many revolutionaries, by the way, who were stranded all across the world, end up in Soviet Union. By this time, it has gone. Russia has become the Soviet Union. Some of them drift off to becoming communists of various shades, but Pandurang is not very convinced, and he goes off to Mexico, where he becomes a very famous agricultural scientist. And many decades later, he actually comes back in the 1950s to India to actually trigger what we now know as the Green Revolution. So the revolutionaries, by the way, did many things, but even the Green Revolution is a result of the revolutionary movement. So the war ends. The revolutionaries tried very hard, but they failed. But now what is going on is that the Indian troops who fought for the British are all coming back home. And the British are very, very scared about this. Why? Because remember, all these regiments had almost revolted in 1915. Now, they are also veterans, so they know how to use the gun, and they have lost their fear of killing the white man. Very big psychological thing at that time. So 1919, all these troops are coming back home, and the revolutionaries are still active there. So the British introduce something called the Rowlatt Acts, which are draconian acts to try and control these incipient revolt that is now likely to happen. This is the context in which those Rowlatt Acts were introduced. You're very often not told why, you are told about that there were these protests, the Indian National Congress was a part of these protests against the Rowlatt Acts. But why were there these Rowlatt Acts? They were there because of the fear of the Ghadarites. So this Ghadarite thing is there. It is particularly there in Punjab, but in rest of India, but even here in Maharashtra, there is this sort of tension there. And so what do? They call on Reginald Dyer, who had been fighting the revolutionaries for so long, and that is the reason he is brought into the game. And of course, this all spirals out into the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Baisakhi Day 1919. But it is not the only massacre. That's the only one you hear about. There are many such massacres that happen. There's Hans in Gujranwala and many other places as well. Large numbers, hundreds of people die in those massacres as well. So, you must remember that when you hear about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, the story is told in a particular way that you get the impression that there was some Congress party meeting that was going to happen, they didn't allow it, and therefore all of this happened. That is not the case. If you don't understand the revolutionary movement, you do not understand the sequence of events that lead to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. That's why I keep telling you, yes, the Congress did have a role, but even the things the Congress was doing was very much influenced by what the revolutionaries were doing. You have to understand the revolutionaries. Now that massacre happens, it leads to a big sort of outcry, and Dyer and his boss O'Dwyer are sent back to Britain. But the British, in order to kind of assuage the situation, they also released some of these well-known revolutionaries who they had incarcerated in Kalapani. And by the way, do remember that Kalapani is not any old jail. This is not luxury wing of Naini jail or Aga Khan Palace. This is a place where you send people to break their spirit. They are whipped regularly, they are worked to the bone, they are electrocuted on a regular basis. Some of them go crazy, some of them commit suicide. So, in 1920, some of these revolutionaries are released. This includes Barin Ghosh, also includes, importantly, Sachindranath Sanyal, who had worked with Raj Bihari earlier to attempt to cause that great revolt. So he comes back, By the time he arrives, the non-cooperation movement is getting going. Many revolutionaries also join it, by the way. But Sachin Sanyal is somewhat suspicious of the whole thing. So he stays away. And then after Chauri Chaura incident, as you know, the whole thing comes crashing down. And many revolutionaries become very disillusioned by this. So this is the point at which Sachin Sanyal decides that he is going to rebuild the old Anushaalan network. So he sets about doing this, and he goes to Punjab, he goes to Bengal, he goes around all over the country, and he begins to rebuild this network of revolutionary cells all across the country. And he brings them together in 1923-24 under an umbrella organization called the Hindustan Republican Association, and under it, the Hindustan Republican Army. And he recruits an entire generation of new revolutionaries. You'll know some of their names: Ram Prasad Bismil, Ashfaqullah Khan, Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, Rajendra Lahiri, and so on and so forth. Now, they all come into the thing, but they have a problem. They have a problem that they don't have any sponsors. They have got this big network, but no guns. So what do? So they decide that they are going to try and buy guns from Germany and other places, but now the Germans are not just going to give it to them, they have to actually buy them with money. So nonetheless, they get hold of a very good swimmer who they sent off to Stuttgart for a international swimming contest. But his actual job is to talk to the manufacturers of a pistol called the Mauser C96, which there was a big favorite of theirs, and buy large quantities of them. So he does get there, he tells them, and they organize to have it shipped to international waters in the Bay of Bengal. And Rajendra Lahiri has given the job of going out with fishing trawlers to bring them in. So they begin doing this, but they have to still pay for it, and they don't have any money. So ultimately, after doing various things, they decide that they will rob a train. And they rob a train in a place called Kakodi, just outside of Lucknow. So this big robbery happens, then they do manage to rob a large amount of money. Unfortunately, they also attract the attention of an amazing British intelligence officer called Charles Taggart. He's there on the cover of my book because he's such an important character. And many revolutionaries, including many members of my family, got into serious trouble trying to kill him. So anyway, meanwhile, so this is all going on. And what happens is they steal this money, but the revolutionaries, remember, these guys are early 20s, some of them even teenagers. They don't actually know that these notes are all properly numbered, and you can actually trace these numbers and trace where this money is being spent. So using these numbers on the notes, the British ultimately managed to capture several of them, and there's a big case called the Kakodi case, in which many of them, Bismil, Ashfaqullah, Rajendra Lahiri, are hanged. Sachin Sanyal is again caught and sent off to Kalapani for the second time, this time for 10 full years. Many members of the Sanyal family also get into serious trouble and sent off in various lengths of time to jail and so on. And so this second second generation of revolutionaries also comes to this abrupt halt. Now, the revolutionary movement falls into the hands of a very young group of people. This is Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, who's now the senior most, but he's in his early 20s. Bhagat Singh is, I think, 19 years old at this stage. These are the people who now come to inherit this network. And they then begin to do a bunch of things. I'm not going to get into the details, but one of the things they do is actually to avenge the killing of Lala Lajpat Rai. So Lala Lajpat Rai is literally beaten to death in Lahore, in public. And Azad and Bhagat Singh and Rajguru basically carry out this assassination attempt of a police inspector called Saunders in Lahore. And then they escape. But a little bit later, Bhagat Singh then also carries out a second attack where he throws a bomb in the Central Legislative Assembly, which is now known as the Parliament. It's still our Parliament. That will change in a few months' time, but it is still our Parliament. And in that, he gets arrested. Ultimately, that entire network gets broken down. But there are other places where this network is still active. For example, in Chittagong, the revolutionaries actually carry out a major raid on the armory there, and for a while hold the city of Chittagong, and then they escape into the hills. There are major gunfights and so on. And so there are these major attacks that happen by the revolutionaries at that point in time. So there is a phase in the late 20s and early 30s where there is these waves of these attacks that are going on. And you know, the British are pretty rattled by all of this. But by about 1933, 34, this wave kind of dies out. All sides are exhausted. The revolutionaries are exhausted, the British are exhausted, and even the non-violent movement led by Gandhi is exhausted. All parties are just exhausted. So there is a period of relative calm in the mid-30s. But by the end of the 1930s, a new kind of wave begins to emerge. What happens is, after spending 10 years in jail, Sachindranath Sanyal comes back to the mainland. Remember, he's done this twice before, got into serious trouble. Clearly has not changed his mind. Because the first thing he does is gets in touch with his old buddy, Raj Bihari Bose. And then what happens is that with the help of the revolutionary movement of revolutionaries who are very active also in the Congress, Netaji wins the election to the Congress. But he's not allowed to operate and is forced to resign. So here we are in 1938, and Netaji and Sachin Sanyal meet at the sides of the Durga Puja in Lucknow. Very appropriate, I suppose, two bongs meeting at the sides of a Durga Puja. And they discuss that, you know, we got to get this movement going again. So they get in touch again with the Japanese. Now remember, the Japanese would not really enter the war till 1942. So this is some way away. But these guys are already in touch with the Japanese and with Raj Bihari, and they are already beginning to reinvigorate these networks. They also begin to get in touch with the regiments, including the one in Fort William. And again, the British are aware that all of this is going on. So the war suddenly erupts, 1939. And as soon as this happens, by 1940, the British are beginning to arrest all these revolutionaries. Again, they know that these guys are up to no good. Sachin Sanyal again gets captured, so does Netaji Subhash Bose. And Sachin Sanyal, by the way, would be deliberately infected with TB in jail, and he would die as a result of that. But Netaji, of course, very famously would escape to all the way through Afghanistan, through Russia, all the way to Germany, where he would request the Germans to help him. Unfortunately, Hitler was not particularly keen on Indians gaining their freedom. For whatever it's worth, his ideology was based on racism, and the Indians were inferior. He actually, ironically, was a great admirer of the British Empire. Not many people know this, that Hitler was a major admirer of the British Empire. All he really wanted was that the British ran their empire, and they would allow them to have, the Germans to have their own empire on the land. So you can have your empire on the sea, and let us have our empire on the land. And that was really what Hitler wanted. He didn't want to give India freedom, and in fact, writes derogatory things about Indians in Mein Kampf. But Netaji was there. He knows he's stuck, because he can clearly see the Nazis are not wildly keen on helping him. He doesn't really know what to do. He's doing one chota-mota things there, but nothing much really. Meanwhile, the Japanese enter the war, and they managed to capture Singapore. And very large numbers of Indian soldiers surrender as part of the surrender of Singapore. So suddenly, for the first time, there is a large number of trained Indian soldiers who have surrendered, and Raj Bihari Bose finally gets to do what he had been trying to do all through, was to get a group of Indian soldiers to essentially revolt against the British. So he turns up in Singapore and he gives this very passionate speech, and tens of thousands of Indian soldiers who had been just a few weeks earlier fighting for the British switch over to form the Indian National Army. I'm telling you this because many people are under the impression that it is Subhash Bose who set up the Indian National Army. No, it was actually the old revolutionary Raj Bihari Bose who founded the Indian National Army, or the Azad Hind Fauj, if you may prefer to call it that way. But unfortunately, by this point, Raj Bihari Bose is a very old man, and his health is failing. So he knows that he is not going to be able to carry on for much longer. So he requests the Japanese to somehow get Netaji to come to Asia, where, of course, very famous, you know the famous story. The Germans bring Netaji by a submarine to the Indian Ocean. He's switched over into a Japanese submarine. He's brought to Singapore, and in Singapore, he takes control of the Indian National Army, where there's a big ceremony in Cathay Theatre, where Raj Bihari Bose, in a very emotional sort of hands it over to Netaji Subhash Bose, the control of the Indian National Army. Now, Netaji now has both the Japanese, and he has an army of his own. He's handed de jure control also of the Andaman Islands, which is also, as you can imagine, a very emotional moment for somebody from the revolutionary movement. And they make their way together through the jungles of Burma into the borders of India. And they fight their way into both Nagaland and Manipur. And the Indian flag and the INA flag is then ceremonially raised in a place called Moirang in Manipur. And there is a large outpouring of support from the Manipuri community to the INA, who provide them with food and people and all kinds of things. Again, many people forget the Manipuri contribution to our freedom struggle. They have many contributions, but one of the big ones is the support they provided to the INA when the INA moved into Manipur in 1943-44. Unfortunately, of course, you know the story. Yet again, the Germans, and this time along with the Japanese, lose the war. And the INA finds itself stranded. It withdraws, heroically fights a losing battle, but eventually it's forced to surrender along with the Japanese. Netaji either dies in that crash or goes missing. I don't have a particular view on either side of that debate, but at the very least, he disappears from the story. So, the revolutionaries yet again seem to have failed, or have they? Because what happens now is that the soldiers of the Azad Hind Fauj are marched back to India, and they are marched all the way to Delhi and put on trial in the Red Fort. Now, this turns out to a very bad idea for the British, because do remember, because of wartime censorship, most Indians actually had no idea what had happened to Netaji and with the INA. They had heard, yes, Netaji had escaped, maybe he's doing something with the Japanese, occasionally some of the messages got through, but they had no idea of the sheer scale of what had happened. And here there are all these thousands of INA soldiers being put on trial, and they find out that, an army of revolutionaries, of an army of liberation, had actually not only fought their way through, along with Netaji, they had actually entered India. And this causes a sensation in the population, not just in the population, but even in the British Indian Army. And why is this important? Because you have to know about what is the situation in the world in late 1945, early 1946. In end of 1945, there is a mass demobilization that is happening across the world. all the British soldiers want to go home, the Australian soldiers want to go home, the American soldiers want to go home. So at least in Asia, the only people who are still holding fort for the Allies is actually the British Indian Army. They are the guys running Egypt, they are running all of the Middle East, they are of course running the Indian subcontinent, they are running Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, what we now know as Indonesia, all the way through to Vietnam. Who is the guys in charge? The Indians. Maybe there's a thin layer of British officers, but it's the British Indian Army that is in charge. They're even in charge of the Japanese prisoners of war. And the British are very, very scared again that if there is now a revolt in this group, this is going to cause chaos. And this is about to happen as well, because not only are they hearing about the INA, they also find that there are all these freedom struggles going on in all these countries that they are occupying. So they are at the receiving end of the Burmese, Malay, Indonesian nationalists. In fact, in Indonesia, there are pitched battles that are happening, because when the Japanese surrendered, before surrendering, they handed all their guns over to the Indonesian nationalists. So the Indonesian nationalists are fighting these pitched battles. First, where the Dutch try to reoccupy those places, so they get kicked out. So they asked help from the British. The British send in the Indian Army. The British Indian Army is now fighting these battles in which thousands of Indonesians die, but hundreds of Indians also die. So the Indians are wondering, why am I fighting? I mean, the British are using me as total cannon fodder. Not only are they trying to protect their own empire, they now want us to fight for, every friend and family's empire that they can find. So they are really annoyed and they are on the brink of revolt. And indeed, they do revolt. And where do they revolt? Right here in Mumbai. This February 1946, a massive revolt happens in the Royal Indian Navy. 20,000 veterans of the Second World War. So these guys are not kids. They may be young in age, but they know how to fire a gun. And they are organized and they are, war veterans. They go and revolt. They capture 77 ships in Mumbai harbor. And they know how to fire those guns. In Karachi, in Kolkata, smaller revolts also happen. The British send in the Maratha regiment to suppress this, because of course the guys who are in the ships, but they are now shore establishments that are also getting captured all across Mumbai, whether it's the castle barracks, there's now INS Angre, or there is in Kolaba, there is a signals unit called INS Talwar, which is now a truck depot, but was then a signals unit, and they're sending signals around the whole countryside, telling people to revolt. So this is what is going on, and there is absolute chaos in all of this. There are students coming onto the streets, there are all kinds of things. I mean, it's a real hotbed of revolt that is building up. Amidst all this, the Maratha regiment is told, you go out there and suppress this revolt. So the Maratha regiment goes out, takes positions, and is told to fire. And they keep firing. But after a little while, the British realize that they're all firing to miss. Nobody on the other side seems to be getting hurt. So they ask for help from the Royal Indian Air Force. And suddenly all the pilots of the Royal Indian Air Force say that their aircraft have developed engine problems. So ultimately the European troops have to be sent in. But the British know that they have completely lost control of India. And it is during this revolt, this naval revolt, that finally Prime Minister Attlee announces the Cabinet Commission on Indian Independence. This is how, ladies and gentlemen, India became free. So, a year later, India does get its independence. And I'm going to now tell you about what happens at the time of independence and a little bit afterwards before I end, because I think it's an important part of your story, my story as well. What happens in independence is that, of course, there is a lot of joy. But there are three communities that provided the bulk of the revolutionaries. One was the Bengalis, the second were the Punjabis, and the third were the Maharashtrians, particularly the Maharashtrian Brahmin community. Sadly, at independence, something very nasty happens to them. For the Punjabis and the Bengalis, partition. So suddenly all of them, many of them who had fought for independence, find that at the moment of independence, they are homeless. There are actually riots going on. They have lost their homes. They are refugees in their own country. Their women are being raped and attacked. And so they end up absolute state of shock. And do remember also that they're utterly leaderless at this point. All their top leaders have been killed by this point. Essentially, Netaji's gone missing or died. Raj Bihari Bose has died meanwhile from illness. Sachin Sanyal had died from TB. Bhagat Singh had been hanged. Bismil had been hanged. Rajendra Lahiri hanged. You can keep going on. The only two people, interestingly, who survived through this whole cycle were actually Vinayak Savarkar and Aurobindo Ghosh. Both of them, by this point, however, had drifted away from the revolutionary movement and become more into cultural issues, and so were not really there to provide them leadership. So here they are leaderless and have lost their homes and in complete chaos. So they don't actually, they are not really in a position to participate not just in the joy of independence, but even in the political structures immediately afterwards. And the similar thing happens also to the Maharashtrian Brahmins with the assassination of Gandhiji by a member of the community. So the whole community is painted with the same brush, and what happens is that there are these massive riots that happen across Maharashtra, but other places also, wherever there was a large Maharashtrian Brahmin community, there are these massive riots in which hundreds are killed, thousands of homes, businesses, etc. are burnt down. Vinayak Savarkar's own brother, Narayan, is dragged onto the streets and actually stoned to death. Savarkar himself narrowly escapes this fate. So, this is what happens. Sadly, to this day, this whole incident is barely talked about. And it is very sad that this happened, because if there had been greater if the story had been more clearly told, perhaps the events of 1984 would not have happened against the Sikhs. Because exactly the same thing happened, often by the same people. Congress workers rampaging around in 1984 was not so different from them doing exactly the same thing in 1948, here in Mumbai particularly, but also in Pune, Nasik, and many other places. So if the lessons of history are not learned to be remember, they always get repeated. But at least I have to say, the story of the 1984 genocide against the Sikhs is talked about. What is not talked about is the 1948, what happened against the Maharashtrian Brahmins, or equally bad, what happened to the Bengali Hindus, which is perhaps even worse. Not only did they go through partition, they would also face 3 million people dead in genocide in 1971. 10 million of them would end up in India as refugees, not in the beginning, but in 1970-71. And many of those people would then actually be massacred in 1979 in what is called the Morij Jhapi massacre. Please read up about how the communists carried out this massacre, in which between 4 and 10,000 Hindu refugees were actually massacred in cold blood by the state. Again, a massacre that nobody talks about, the Morij Jhapi massacre. I've written about it in my book very briefly, but it is one of the most shameful episodes in Indian history, and it's again not talked about. This entire story of the revolutionaries and their contributions, hopefully I gave you a flavor of it. It's a very thin sliver of what happened. It's a story worth knowing. Because after independence, not only were they treated shabbily, this entire story of the revolutionaries was actually wiped out of their our memories. The individuals continue to be remembered, but the movement itself is hardly talked about. Those who participated in it were mostly ignored. The INA veterans, the veterans of the Royal Indian Navy, they were not even treated as freedom fighters. For many decades later, they were not given that status. It is only in 2021 that the last few remaining INA veterans were taken on the parade on Republic Day on Rajpath in Delhi. In 1922, this is in 2021. I didn't mean 1921. 2021. And in 2022, finally, Netaji reached Delhi. His statue now stands proudly on Rajpath, or now called Kartavya Path, taking a salute. And all future Republic Day parades, no matter who the president is, they are all being, the salute that will be taken will be to Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, who stands proudly at the end of the parade, path of the parade. So in many ways, finally, after 75 years of independence, this story is again being told. And I hope through my book or through word of mouth, books of other people, these amazing characters of history will be brought back alive. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks, Sanjeev. Thanks. That was outstanding. Please be seated. Like I said, we do get some questions beforehand. Some are prepared by my team here. So, Sanjeev, we will start with some of the questions, and we will have questions flowing in. So, you can please. Might be better seated. So, I think the first question, and Sanjeev, we keep talking about this, that in general, Indians are bad in documentation and definitely bad in documenting history, and maybe worse in documenting the history we don't want to know. So just a straight question, in writing this book, how did you go about it? One, that the information would have been sparse, sources may not have been reliable, I don't know how many people willing to help you. So just a little bit on how you went about writing this book and getting to the bottom of this.
Thanks. So let me actually say that Indians are not bad at documenting. There is actually unbelievable amounts of evidence on this. And not just from British records. All those who participated in these events have left copious amounts of information on their lives and ideas. Many of the things that I've written in my book are taken from testimonies and biographies written both before independence by some of these, like Sachindranath Sanyal's Bandi Jeevan, or Bismill's autobiography, which he wrote on death row. And so many of, and there's a huge amount of underground literature that has survived in various forms. So there's plenty of testimonies from the revolutionaries. There's plenty of eyewitness testimonies. There are British intelligence records which are now digitized and available. There is piles of information. So the problem was never information. In fact, I could have written this book to becoming, 5 times the size of what I have done if I tried to tell everything. But I kept it to something because I wanted to tell the broader story so that people, a general audience could get it. So the really interesting story is not about lack of information. The really interesting story is the deliberate suppression of this story after independence. It is not the case, I'm okay with the idea that the Nehruvians, having captured power, and I'm saying Nehruvians because it wasn't the Congress in general, even the revolutionaries very often were a part of the Congress. But one branch of the Congress came to power, the Nehruvians, and having come to power, they did what is perhaps human, is they exaggerated their role in the independence struggle, which is also acceptable at some level. But what they did next is actually unforgivable, which is they systematically went about blanking out the contributions of other streams of the freedom struggle. So let me show you what they did with the revolutionaries. They began to pull down all things that would be memorials to these revolutionaries. So for example, when you go to cellular jail, do remember that the cellular jail, you only see two of the radials that are there today. There actually were many more radials. They were all pulled down. And even these two nearly got pulled down till at the very last minute, big agitation happened and it was stopped. Otherwise, you would not have been able to go to Port Blair and see the evidence of the cellular jail. Similarly, when you go to Delhi, there is something called Maulana Azad Medical College, MAMC. Now, MAMC is built actually on the grounds of the old Delhi jail. And many famous revolutionaries were hanged in that jail. So when MAMC was being created, the revolutionaries in 1950s, they requested that can at least the place where the gallows have been done turned into a memorial. This was actually accepted by Nehru and at the prime ministerial level. But when the college was actually opened, they found that it had been demolished and it had been cleared away. And so systematically they were wiped out of their story. There was a famous historian called R.C. Majumdar who was given the job of writing the official history of India's freedom struggle. So when he began to write the freedom struggle, he talked about the other streams of freedom and correctly presented the Nehruvians as being one of many. So he was actually removed from the chairmanship of the writing of the official history of the freedom struggle. And so we ended up with the official history, mainstream narrative that you and I know. Bina Khadak, Bina Dhal story. But thankfully, enough of the material survived. What I have done really is just simply collect it together and string it together so that you know that this is not a story of individual heroism, but is a movement with a clear agenda, clear objectives, and so on. In fact, as I said before, it was the revolutionaries rather than the Gandhians and the Nehruvians who first asked for Purna Swaraj. When the Gandhians were asking for dominion status right up to 1929-30. It was the revolutionaries who were asking for Purna Swaraj. And it is they also who talked about India being a republic first and of a democratic republic in the early 1920s. So the Hindustan Republican Association's constitution has clearly mentions we want to have a federated republic of India which will be a democracy through universal franchise, which is also a big deal because remember, universal franchise is not at this stage synonymous with democracy. Even in the UK at this stage, women did not have voting rights. So the revolutionaries have enormous contributions, not just to the freedom struggle, but to the way we think of India today. But all of this is unknown to most people.
And in this, did you find, like you said, the intelligence records, but historian records also of people who were British or of Western descent?
Yes, there are many people who have written about them. We have, so it's not just the British have written, they have, of course, they saw Indians in, just as, terrorists and so on. Now, my own finding on this is whether somebody is a terrorist or is called the resistance depends on whether they are white or not. The French fighting the Nazis are the French resistance. Indians fighting the British, terrorists.
So Sanjeev, any parallels that you've come across during your research in other countries where this may have happened in a similar way, where their own people have sort of de-recognized or forgotten the history of the people who contributed to their past?
See, various forms of politics is there in every freedom struggle, so that it's not the case. But I think in no other place have they been so systematically wiped out. Because you see, in most other places, the new regime that came to power had some elements of various groups. Or at the very least, maybe one group came, they were wiped out, another group came, and so on. So I'm sure there are places where this may exist. But India is one case where two things happened. One is that the Nehruvians, having come to power, they stayed in power for a very long period of time. So that was one part of it. But it's only one part of it, and in fact may not even be the more important part of it. There is a second reason which is even more important. The second reason is that the Nehruvians, having come to power and having pushed out various other, rival claimants to power, they then created an alliance with the class of Indians who had collaborated with the British. And this collaborator class then became an ally of the Nehruvians. So to be fair, the Nehruvians had been part of the freedom struggle, but the collaborator class had been very much a part of oppressing those who were fighting for freedom, particularly the revolutionaries. So you had, for example, those who had... so by the way, when I say collaborator, I don't mean anybody who had something to do with the British. Obviously, we were Indians, we were under their rule. I mean, school teacher in a government school is also working for the government. He doesn't become a collaborator. I'm talking about people who actively went out of their way to collaborate with the British. So for example, Indian officials of the Imperial Police Service who were actually hunting the revolutionaries. They were the people who actually ordered the firing against the strikers during the Royal Indian Navy Revolt in 1946. These are the people who were contractors who were supplying Indian troops in the First World War to the British war effort and so on. So this collaborator class were actually the biggest beneficiaries of independence. What happens is that in most countries, when this independence happens, the independent freedom struggle people come into power, they throw out the old collaborators, they bring their own people in. In India, yes, there were a few people who came from the Nehruvian branch of the freedom struggle. They got positions of power. But for the most part, in the name of continuity, this old collaborator class actually was kept on in positions of power. In fact, many of them got promoted because now the British were leaving, they just got promoted up further. So the intellectual, administrative class of India, immediately after independence, was largely made up of the collaborator class. And they were the ones who actually wrote our histories. They provided the intellectual frameworks that not just them, but in many cases because of their access to education and the English language in particular, they even continued into the second and third generation. Many of them are still around. And it is they who wrote our history books. And of course, for them it was very important because they remember many of those chaps or their dad or granddad had been source of they were the informers and collaborators who had killed many of these freedom fighters. They then told the story in a peculiar way. So I mean, many people do not know, for example, there was a famous Hindi writer called Yashpal. He was actually a collaborator and informer and was the source of information that led to the killing of Chandrasekhar Azad, for example. So this kind of thing happened, and you can go and do your own Google search to who is the descendant of whom. But point of the matter is, this group of people had an important role also in a continuing story that we have, that India did not exist before 1947. Yeah. This is interestingly not the view of the Nehruvians also. After all, Nehru, at independence, when he gives the speech, in his speech, he says, no, the soul of a nation long suppressed finds utterance. He doesn't say the soul of a union of state long suppressed finds utterance. So the story of India being this didn't exist as a nation exactly, is a very important part of the story these collaborators were telling themselves. Because if India didn't exist before 1947, then they couldn't have been traitors. Because how could you be a traitor to a country that didn't exist? So they then therefore continued a colonial narrative of India didn't exist as a country or a nation before the British turned up. It was very important part of the story these people told themselves, and they continued it down. And you find this popping up even now in an intellectual class. Anybody ever tells you this, just ask them a little bit later, very casually, who was your grandfather?
Sanjeev, a rhetorical question on this, and you may elaborate a bit more, but I know we've not told stories about our heroes as well, but is there any attempt to also bring out maybe another book which talks about the stories of this underbelly of some of the people? Every time, even in your speech just now, you said of many things which could have happened, didn't happen because somebody just went to the other side. Any plans of a book on that?
Yeah, some of you guys should go and write these books also. Why just me? Why relying on me?
Okay.
And many of these people, you don't need to work very hard to find out who they are. Many of them are sitting right in front of you. Very often on television studios, in debates on history, in giving lectures on India's foreign policy. Find out who they are.
So, Sanjeev, little personal, but you spoke and you've written about Sachindranath Sanyal. For some of us who know you slightly, we have some idea of the whole relationship, but not exactly delving into personal bit. But can you talk a little bit more about his life, his role? We know he's your granddad's elder brother, if I'm not mistaken. And so, if you can just give us a little bit more idea about Sachindranath Sanyal.
So, both my mother's and my father's family were very much involved in the freedom struggle on the revolutionary side of things. My father's family, Bengalis, had moved to Varanasi in the late 18th century, and they lived in a neighborhood called Bengali Tola, which is mentioned in the book as well. And Sachindranath Sanyal is my granduncle, and many of my granduncles, not just Sachin Sanyal, and even my own grandparents were very involved in all of these things. Now, I have not mentioned everybody in the book, otherwise it was becoming too much like a family history. So I have mentioned Sachin Sanyal mostly because he was the best known and probably the most important of those characters. But on the sides, there are many other members of the Sanyal family who were very much involved in this. Of course, they all got into serious trouble, as you can imagine. And Sachin Sanyal's family, his branch of the family, all their properties got taken over after the Ghadar episode. But then when he came back and he began to do activities there, again back in Bengali Tola, the British decided that the wider family was a problem as well. So after the Kakodi case in 1926-27, the entire family was essentially thrown out of Varanasi. My branch ended up in Allahabad, now called Prayagraj, and another branch ended up in Gorakhpur. But of course, they were unrepentant, as you can imagine. In fact, Chandrasekhar Azad was supposed to come to our house in Allahabad when he got trapped in Alfred Park and got killed, or shot himself, more accurately. So my family continued very much to be a part of that movement, and various members did various things. My grandmom, for example, would tell me stories how, as a young bride, Sachin Sanyal's wife, Pratibha, one of the first things she did was make her sit down and go through a drill. So she was in her teens at that point, young bride, and she is completely confused. But Pratibha Sanyal, she's the matriarch of the family. So sits her down and says, "Okay, this is what will happen. Here is a stopwatch. There will be strange people who will come to the house and ask for food and a laundry change. Let them in, and then set the clock on. And within a certain, I think there was 4 minutes or 5 minutes, you have to feed them, do the clothes changeover and various other things, give them this money that's been kept for them, and they have to be out. This is the route for them to leave the house from the back, and they have to be out of here. And never ask them who they are." Okay? And the reason this was done was that our house was in Colonelganj in Allahabad, and the Sanyal family had worked out that there were always some vague people loitering around outside. They were basically police informers, so we knew that. So we had worked out how much time it took to walk to the nearest police station, how much time it took to mobilize those fellows into a whatever horse buggy or whatever they used then, or truck or whatever, and come back here. So that they had worked out to be some 4 minutes or 5 minutes. So in that time, the revolutionaries had to come in, do their laundry switchover, have a quick bite or pick up their food, leave whatever they had to leave behind, messages, etc., take money or whatever they had to take, and then they had a route through several routes out through neighbors' roofs and leave. So this drill was absolutely drilled, and you had to be so regular basis, somebody would come, bunch of these would come, they would be sent and they would leave, and immediately after that the police would raid the house. So this is my father's family. Now my mother's family were also into all of this. So my mother's father's family were into this, later became become industrialists and so on. But my mother's family were also Sanyals, by the way. Coincidentally, they were not related, they have the same surname. Gentleman called Nalinaksha Sanyal. Now, Nalinaksha Sanyal and his elder brother Anadikanta Sanyal were very much a part of Bhagajutin's Yugantar group, which I mentioned, the bunch who were waiting for the German guns to turn up. And they were also, by the way, hunting this Charles Tigard. So Anadikanta Sanyal, after having managed to be a part of several killings of Calcutta police special branch officers, he was ultimately apprehended, taken to Rangpur jail, where he was essentially beaten to death. Nalinaksha Sanyal, of course, would continue. He would then be later in the 1920s be brought into the Congress party by C.R. Das at about the same time that Netaji was brought in. They were roughly the same age. So he was very close to Netaji. They were part of something of the Congress. They together set up something called the Bengal Volunteers, which would also become a revolutionary group in the early 30s. And then he was very much involved in getting Netaji elected as the president of the Congress. And then after Netaji escaped and sort of left the Congress, he then became the chief whip of the Congress party in the undivided Bengal Provincial Assembly. And he was basically the leader of the opposition during the Second World War and the Great Bengal Famine of 1943.
Thanks, Sanjeev. Sanjeev, you sort of told us a little about how the what was generally called the more peaceful movement in the freedom struggle and its interplay with the revolutionary side. And then there's also this whole thing about the Lal Bal Pal, or what they call the Jahal group within the Congress. So what was the sort of interactions between these groups, the interplay? Were they completely isolated from each other? Were they working together?
So the revolutionaries, by the way, were very close to the Lal Bal Pal trio. Aurobindo Ghosh, in fact, attended the 1907 Surat conference and was a very senior member of that, and many revolutionaries were very close to this. And there, of course, as famously, there's a split between the extremists and the moderates. But even the terms extremists and moderates is very interesting in its own right, because it gives you the impression there were these extreme people who were asking for freedom, and there were these moderate people who were asking for these chota-mota things. So they were reasonable and one people were extreme. This tells you a lot about who wrote the subsequent history more than anything else. Yeah. If the Lal Bal Pal and the revolutionaries had written this history, they would have used different terms. And in my book, I used those terms. They would have called one group the nationalists and the others the loyalists. This is not my term. This is what Sri Aurobindo used.
Sanjeev, you referred about a large presence of people from Punjab, Bengal, and Maharashtra in this whole movement. A specific question from one of our audience, but anything to share more from people from the south, and I think there's a name, Vanjanathan, etc. Any more?
So while there were people from these three provinces were big contributors, also UP, by the way. But yes, I mean, all parts of India contributed to the freedom struggle. So these three provinces turn up everywhere because they were the most hotbeds of this. But there were people from the south, from the north, east, west, center, everywhere there were people. And you have, for example, from the south, VVS Iyer, who was actually Savarkar's right-hand man in India House.
Yeah.
And similarly, when Netaji formed the INA, Rajbihari formed the INA and then Netaji took control of it. Of course, there were the soldiers of the British Indian Army who had switched sides, but there were large numbers of Tamils of the Malaysia, Singapore area who also joined the army. And so there were large number of Tamils from Southeast Asia who were a part of the INA as well. So there was others. Then there was Alluri Sitarama Raju, now famous because of RRR, who was also a part of the revolutionary movement. But I did not find in any of the records anything about his ability to dance. So we have no idea about whether he was a good dancer or not. I leave that to your imagination.
Sanjeev, I remember having discussed this with you, I think, a couple of years back as well. But with what we're talking about history and maybe not the correct representation always, what's your view about rewriting school history books so that what we went through, the next generation at least doesn't go through and we get to know a much better and all-rounded view of our history?
Well, everybody knows my view on this because there have been many WhatsApp clips of my views on the need to rewrite history that have floated around for the last several years. So, of course, I think it's time we get on with it and redo the textbooks, rewrite our stories and retell them based on facts. I'm not in favor of replacing one bunch of nonsensical lies with another bunch of lies. The story we need to tell has to be based on primary evidence and a proper telling of the story. So some part of it, of course, takes time because you have to actually create the intellectual material for it. But I think that momentum is now building up and we should do it. Meanwhile, I, on my own efforts, have, together with Chinmay Mission, have actually written a set of textbooks for class 6, 7 and 8, which are already now being taught at many schools. So the Chinmay Mission schools are already teaching us alternative set of textbooks, and now many of the Vidya Bharati schools are, I think, also teaching them. So this is already happening. I'm not saying that there are no mistakes in them. We are open to feedback. I'm sure there are lots of mistakes in there. I have myself found the odd one and given feedback. So, but the point is, now, quite frankly, NCERT should get on with it and come up with new textbooks. I believe to be fair, they are working on them.
Yeah, which brings us to a question which I think is a bit sometimes not asked but controversial. We've had a government which we believe genuinely would do something about this over the last 8-9 years. Some of what you said, the statue of Netaji in Delhi is one representation. But on this specific subject, rewriting history, what is the government's view, track record, current plans?
Well, let me say that this has to be a bottom-up movement. This should not be, in my view, a top-down movement. So it is very important that demands for this change appear from below, that new stories appear from below. And it doesn't even have to be just the central government. This can be done in states, it can be done in municipalities. These are the stories you tell. These are the stories you demand from Bollywood. These are the stories you demand from Amazon Prime. This, if you begin demanding it, it will happen. So, in the end, this has got to be a mass movement.
So, Sanjeev, I know we've all to officially launch your book as well. So, this is our very usual question. What's your message for this audience of Ville Parle?
My message is that, look, any country that, especially given our history of foreign suppression for such long periods of time, we need to have the confidence to tell our own stories. Because if we do not tell our own stories, somebody will tell it for you. It is not that a vacuum remains. And your understanding of yourself will then become from their lens. And here I must tell you something about a man who is not appreciated enough, Sri Aurobindo. So let me tell you a little bit about him. You see, Sri Aurobindo sadly has been reduced to a hermit of Pondicherry. But he was actually the father, in many ways, of our freedom struggle. He was a very important character in the Indian National Congress. He was also a very, very important sort of the intellectual father of the revolutionary movement. And in many ways, he triggered this whole sequence of events that I talked about. But he himself, he of course escaped to Pondicherry to evade arrest. And in the beginning, he remained in the mainstream revolutionary movement. But then he kind of drifts away. And in fact, many revolutionaries, including Sachin Sanyal, for example, are somewhat unhappy about their great leader suddenly drifting off like this. But why did he do it? And it's a very interesting reason. He came to the conclusion by around about 1920 that it was a matter of time before India got its political freedom. And that he had somehow got the ball rolling on that. So one way or the other, a decade here or there, India would get its political freedom. But he was of the belief that the real battle is not about political freedom, but about the freedom of our minds. And he was very, very concerned about the deracination of the Indian to the point that they have begun to think of the world from somebody else's perspective. So he really got going on trying to mend this. So he begins to write books like The Secret of the Vedas and so on. And there he expresses the need to rethink India from our own indigenous perspective. And it tells you something that this is a debate that we are still having to this day. So think about what he was trying to do. So he won the thing that he got going on the political freedom we got in 1947. The second battle that Sri Aurobindo got going, we are still fighting today.
Thank you. Friends, Sanjeev has done, and I think when we spoke about 6 months back, when he was just about to sort of getting ready for his book launch, the first function happened early January, Sanjeev, which was done by Honorable Home Minister. He's done more than 20 programs, but I'm so happy that he chose Prabodhan Mancha Parle for the Mumbai launch of his book. So Sanjeev, let's do the honors. Sanjeev, I'm personally quite aware of your schedule. I've met you at early mornings and late evenings, but in fact, yesterday you took a midnight flight to join us. So thank you so much for taking the time and effort to be here with us in Mumbai. As they say, history is always written by the victors, but unfortunately, when your own history gets loaded with narratives of one side, you ought to be careful. On a very lighter note, in the morning when we were putting up this backdrop, we thought we'll run a quiz today and see how many people recognize all the faces and have a prize of those who can get all of them. But I think, Sanjeev, if we read your book, we will know those names for sure. So for highlighting the shortcomings and of what has happened till date, but for so nicely bringing out the linkages in that whole revolutionary movement, a very big thank you again, Sanjeev, to you. I know that you are encouraging and inspiring many young authors. Vikram spoke about it last time he was here. So maybe someone from Ville Parle will get inspired and write a book about 1948. Well, now for a formal vote of thanks. Again, first and foremost to Sanjeev, thank you for being here. Thank you for spending the time. To BMC for the hall, Tendulkarji and Sai Raj Arts for the banners and backdrop, Vastu Shobha for our stage, Avinash Paradkar for our sound, Virag Vision for videography. Our two elected representatives from Ville Parle, Parag, our MLA, and Abhijit Samant, our local representative at BMC, Honorable Governor Padmanabh Acharya ji, you're always there. Thank you for being with us. Of course, a very big thanks to our 300 plus contributors. But last but not the least, again, on a Sunday morning for being here in such a large number, thank you to each one of you for continually inspiring us. I have one announcement to make, and which is, last time we were lucky enough to announce our next program, and that continues. 28th May is Veer Savarkar's birthday. This gentleman, and as a befitting tribute to this most deserving patriot of this motherland, we will host a theatrical adoption, or Natyavalokan as they say, of his book Majhi Janmathep, produced by our own Anantrao Panshikar. So please join us on 28th May. Ladies and gentlemen, after a short break, Sanjeev will be available to sign his book. It's available for sale outside. And we will close this part with a rendition of Vande Mataram.
Vande Mataram, Vande Mataram, Sujalam Sukhalam, Malayaj Sheetalam, Sasya Shyamalam Mataram, Vande Mataram, Shubhrajyotsna Pulakitayamini, Pullakusumita Drumadala Shobhini, Suhasini Sumadhura Bhashini, Sukhadam Varadam Mataram, Vande